Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. It's the 24th session of Journey Down the Clackamas, which will last more than a year into this coming May. And we apologize, of course, for the cancellation of last week's class. It was just too kind of overwhelming a question for our presenters, and they weren't quite sure where to go, so we're going to move on. I'm Bill Monroe. I'm a board member of the Clackamas River Basin Council, and tonight with me is Tim Shibaharo, who's also a board member, who's going to help with the technical aspects, as will Cheryl McGinnis, who is our executive director. And just to cover a few things, since we were founded 26 years ago, we've worked, the Basin Council has worked as a non-governmental group of stakeholders to protect and improve the basin and its tributaries. Our mission is to foster partnerships, that's really important, for clean water and improve fish and wildlife habitat and the quality of life for everyone who lives, works, and recreates in the watershed, including our water users, which is nearly 500,000. On behalf of the Basin Council, I'd like to thank a couple of gold sponsors, the Beverage Recycling Cooperative and Clackamas Water Environmental Services, and bronze sponsors, Clackamas River Water Providers, the Geological Society of the Oregon Country, Fort Blakely, and Metro. And thanks also to so many individuals and professionals who have donated to support the conference. We continue to seek additional donations, and we are a tax-deductible organization. The basin has been occupied by Native peoples for millennia. It is originally the territory of Clackamas, Chinook, Molalla, Kalapuya, and other peoples, and is currently recognized as lands of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, and other Native peoples who may not be federally recognized. We thank those who came before us for their stewardship and waters, and those who continue to steward them now and forever. We are gathered for this journey down the Clackamas, and we'll start our presentation. Remember to keep yourself muted and type your questions in the chat, and we will answer them as they pop up at the end of each presentation. We have two presenters tonight. We'll go until about 7:15, maybe a little bit longer, depending on the questions. And our presenters, Dave Stewart is a stream restoration biologist for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, where he's worked for more than 20 years. Dave has a BS in Fisheries Science from Oregon State University and has been active in many fish habitat restoration projects across Northwest Oregon, including several here in the Clackamas Basin. He's a very important member of our efforts. Dave Bugney, another Dave, is retired civil structure engineer. He's the chair-elect for our Clackamas River Basin Council and on the board of the Clackamas County Farm Forestry Association. The Bugney family are small woodland owners on 83 acres, and they were the 2020 Clackamas County Woodland Farmers of the Year and recipients of the joint Department of Forestry and ODFW Fish and Wildlife Steward Award for forest lands. Dave has managed and or placed more than 100 logs, 150 tons of gravels, and 200 boulders within the stream that runs through their property, Suter Creek, by the way. He's designed riverine and coastal structures for almost 40 years and holds a master's degree in structural engineering and mechanics from the University of California, Berkeley. So, welcome, Dave. As they introduce and present an introduction to stream restoration and protection practices for the landowner. Dave Stewart, I believe, is first.
Yep. All right. Let me share my screen here. All right. Is everybody seeing that presentation? Yep. Perfect. Get this situated here. All right. So today, thanks, Bill, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm going to start off with a high-level introduction to stream restoration, and I've got a big, not a surprise, but we're going to have Dave Bugney, who Bill mentioned, is going to come on in the second half of this to really dig into some case studies. So I think it's pretty exciting. I'm going to do more of the high-level stuff, and then we're going to jump into some more projects. So just getting started here, I just want to give you a quick little summary of kind of what we do, what I do, what I've been doing for the last 10 years. Like Bill said, I've been doing this for about 20 years. The first 10 years of my career was with the research lab. So I've kind of split it between restoration and research. But essentially, every day in and day out, forest practices, watershed councils, local landowners, coordinating, providing technical assistance. That's daily kind of my job duties, is working with landowners out there to try to teach them, to help them implement stream restoration projects. So the North Willamette Watershed District is the area we work in. You can see smack dab, kind of almost in the middle of this, is Portland, and you can see the Clackamas River coming in from the east, flowing towards Portland. But our district is really bigger than the Clackamas. We also have the Sandy, the Malala, all the way down up to the Yamhill on the other side of the Willamette, and then down to the Claskanai. So we have a pretty diverse area to implement stream restoration projects, and including the work we do around Portland. So it keeps it interesting. So there's always something exciting going on, and always a diverse group of people. But today I really want to talk about, when I get into these things, there's a lot involved here. I want to really break this down. And today there's going to be kind of less on the watershed reach process function stuff, less on life histories, less on the connection of habitat to fish. And really, I'm going to focus on those actions that everybody should, we should be thinking about here. And it's still going to be a little high level. Some of the other things that I don't touch on, and maybe that Dave doesn't touch on, we're going to have future presentations that are going to dig deeper into this. So whenever I start this out, I think we should all be thinking about, obviously our watershed, the basin. If in this situation, the Clackamas Basin, identifying the big picture items is going to be important to identify what we're going to be doing here. And once we can identify the bigger picture items, we can bring that down into, potentially into the reach where you're interested in. A lot of times I'll meet with a landowner up in their property, and they'll have a question like, my bank is eroding, what can I do? Or I want to help fish, where do I get started? So I always try to put in context of the bigger picture and how does that fit in when we draw it into their specific reach. And a key to this is obviously the watershed councils. The Clackamas River Basin Council is a critical partner here, but ODFW is always available, and there's multiple partners and folks that I don't talk about today. Just realize, there's a lot of people out there that can help you if you have questions around stream restoration. And for me, whenever I get started, I'm thinking about, assessments, understanding, again, a little bit deeper, because when you see things on the ground, it's hard to tell exactly what's going on. So if you have questions about this, something I spend a lot of my time doing is actually doing stream surveys. So I can come out and make a trip out to your property, and within literally, less than an hour, have a pretty good idea of what's going on there. And I can start to make some, tell a story and give you some ideas of some things you can do. So there's some big words that are going to pop out today, channel grading, the, channel evolution model, transport versus depositional reaches. These are all things that you don't have to totally understand today, but just realize there's a lot that goes into these restoration projects. A lot of smart people behind the scenes that are helping us understand what's going on, and ultimately that will help you understand what type of project we can implement. And that's where I'm kind of trying to get today is to help you understand not only the types of projects, but the species. And again, we're going to dig more into species on future presentations, but just really high level. This just shows you there's a lot of species involved, not only the salmon and trout and lamprey and the things we all hear about. There's also, sculpins and minnows and other little critters that are really important to the diversity of a functioning ecosystem that we don't hear a lot about. But ultimately, coho salmon are all ESA listed fish. They're on the Endangered Species Act, so they generate a lot of press, right? A lot of funding comes to help these species, but ultimately, if we're fixing habitat for salmon and steelhead, we're probably fixing habitat for a lot of different species. So I'm not going to dig into much other than that because I want to touch base more on the habitat requirements of some of these fish. And when we get out there, you can break down the habitat in a few different ways. Spawning, rearing, migration. There's three, really you can think about this as three key components of this. Are we trying to address, deficiencies in spawning habitat? Is it rearing habitat we're trying to create? Are there migration barriers, issues with migration? And this factors into our limiting factors analysis. So what factor is limiting the production, the natural production of salmon and steelhead and trout in these rivers? And this really comes down to more analysis, more things that you don't necessarily, we won't have time to dig in today, but just getting down to understanding what type of project we want to do here and where we'll implement it. And I've got an example, a project, Cub Creek in the Upper Basin, we've been kind of developing and working on, and that one ties in. I'll touch base a little bit on that as we go here. And just a little more information, and I don't know if you can see the salmon in that fuzzy picture, but there's a spawning salmon down, if you can see it there, sitting on a red. But habitat selection is key. These fish understand where to select based on the gravel size, the depth of the water, the velocities, the temperature. All this comes in, and they don't, obviously don't think about it, but it's critical, to allow them to either spawn or not to spawn in an area. And if they can't spawn, or if they try to spawn and they're not successful because the habitat is subpar, then that's going to impact, future generations. A couple of other shots of just some red activity, and obviously the building of the red and where they're laying their eggs is a critical component here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the period and the development of, as they get through their life cycle a little bit here, and keep it high level. But like I said at the start, rearing, we've got spawning, rearing, migration. Just remember that, spawning, rearing, migration. So what are we talking about here? So juvenile rearing habitat. We could be looking at, you can see the photo in the lower left, there's a couple of logs that are in the stream channel providing some cover for fish. On the right side, it's, potentially just your typical side channel, right? So you can imagine what we're looking for is cover for these fish. They're trying to survive. These, a lot of these fish are, not much bigger than your finger and at certain periods of their life, and they're trying to survive out here, avoid predators. So what we're doing when we say wood, and we talk a lot about wood, we're spending a lot of money putting large wood back into the creek, and part of that is just protection. It does a lot of other channel forming processes, but I'm not gonna dig into that right now. Just understand that wood is a key component, and particularly in winter. So next time you go to a stream channel, any stream channel, just go and look up and take a look and see, does it look like this, where there's not a single speck of wood, or is there actually wood that's functioning? And try to understand what that wood's doing around the structure. Is it creating habitat for juvenile fish? Is it scouring out a pool? That's essentially what we're doing here. So you can imagine when these streams get up to, this is kind of summertime example where fish are rearing throughout the year. But you can imagine as high as the water, comes up and it starts to get, much more extreme here, they need places to rear, and the wood provides them a little bit of cover, a little bit of refugia for them to actually survive in these situations. And I just want to touch one more time on that limiting factors. It's a very important part of this, and it allows us to understand, what life stages we're going to be addressing, what factors we're going to be talking about to implement these projects. And we're going to get into anchor habitats here in a second. But really it comes down, here's a few restoration actions. So these are some of the things that we're doing every day. We're thinking about, we're talking about this, and this isn't everything, but this is just a few. So Dave Bugney in a bit is going to show you some really cool photos and some case studies on fish passage projects, some stuff that he's done. But this is really where we kind of start, because if you think about it, the life history of these fish, of salmon and steelhead, they're anadromous. So they're migrating, they're born in the freshwater, they're migrating out to the ocean, they're coming back to spawn. So obviously if there's a passage barrier in the middle there that's restricting them to get up to their spawning habitat, that's going to affect, the survival there. So we're going to talk a little about fish passage. We're going to talk a little about water quality. Floodplain off-channel habitats are critical as well to multiple species that we're going to discuss today. Riparian protection, and then we're going to dig into quite a bit here on the large wood structures, show you some examples of those. And then there's a few other things we're just going to touch on: high level nutrient supplementation, bank protection. I think Dave's going to touch on a few of these as well. And then gravel augmentation. So I love this photo because this is an example of a fish passage structure, that one that isn't doing, that wasn't doing that well. So it was, this is actually, you can't see this anymore because it's been fixed, but this is the road coming above this box culvert is Stark Street coming from Gresham to Troutdale. And if you were to go down to the Skyland Pub, you could walk up Stark Street and see the new structure here. It's pretty amazing because this failed, obviously, and fish weren't passing this area for a while. And now the structure that's been replaced is a massive culvert that you could literally drive a truck through. So ultimately, in any of these fish passage projects, we're trying to make these structures seem like it's not there. We're trying to allow these fish to pass without, essentially in this situation, and this is a long culvert, but imagine the stream where the fish can actually migrate through without the impacts of a structure, essentially. I want to touch just quickly on water quality because, again, if you think about that life history of a fish that, say, is spawning up in the forest land, it's migrating out through the Clackamas, and now potentially it's going down through some urbanized areas, right? That might be a stream like this with some trash in it. It might be high water temperatures, impervious surfaces. There's a lot of different things that are affecting the water quality, and that not only includes temperature, but there's a number of factors that will impact the survival. So next time you're out there hitting the hitting the burrito shop or whatever, just we all, I think, sometimes forget about this, but there's streams all around us, right? Under us, under the concrete, they're in the ditch, whatever it is. So there's fish potentially out there trying to survive. So be thinking about that. What can we do to actually, is there a project we can do to help these areas? This is a hydrograph, and this just shows essentially on the bottom going across, it just shows time. So in the winter time, and the flow, as you can see, this is kind of what happens when you have a lot of concrete in the surface and impervious surfaces. The stream flows jump up, they spike. So they spike up and then they go down. They spike up throughout the winter. What we want to do is really attenuate these high spikes and really flatten them out a little bit. And that's some of the work we do with the large wood restoration. Some of the in the upper basin is going to help those lower reaches, because by spreading out, by adding large wood, it's slowing down velocities, it's reconnecting those, it's engaging those floodplain habitats. Water is engaging the groundwater, it's getting stored. So not only is it decreasing flood flows, but in the summertime, you're actually getting more cold water that's flowing out of these groundwater, out of the aquifers and that whole groundwater system. So it's just kind of a snippet to show you that's, from a graphical format. But before we move on, I just want to take a deep breath here, because this is a great stopping point. I'm past midway of my point, and I'm going to be giving this off to Dave here in a little bit. But let's take a deep breath and think about the stream, because as we all take a deep breath here and realize the stream kind of needs to do the same thing. We need to give it room to breathe. How do you, when you're out there in your stream channel, how are we giving that stream channel a little bit more opportunity to breathe, to function naturally? I mean, essentially, that's all we're doing here. We're trying to restore some of those natural processes. This is actually in the lower estuary on the coast, but it really gives you a high level perspective of the difference between an area on the left of this photo, which is kind of leveed and diked, and the other side, which it used to be and has been reconnected. And obviously, all those channels in there now have potentially fish, rearing habitat. And the other channel does have rearing habitat, but it's just not, it's not as accessible. There's tide gates and things like that. So back to the urbanized stream. What is the difference between what we just saw here and this stream? What is missing here? I'm sure probably many of us can look at this and think of a few things, problems with this stream. But this is essentially, warm water temperatures, no habitat, no side channels. These are the sorts of things that we can really start, depending on where the project is and the priorities and where those anchor habitats are. These are some things we could start thinking about fixing. And if you're a landowner in this area, then this is something that we can help out with. So I mentioned this before, natural channel processes and function. Without getting too deep into this, just think about restoring channel function. The ultimate goal here is to give the stream room to fix some of the problems, but allow the channel to actually create its own habitat. We want to add wood, but we also wanted to create natural habitat as we go. And obviously the urban channel is a little bit different than being up in the forested land on what we can do there. But a big part of this is reconnecting those floodplains, and I'll show you here. This is a good example of really an urban stream. This is kind of in the lower Clackamas area. This is a project that was completed. You can see the cabling, some of the large wood, how it's cabled. This is essentially because you're in an area where you can't, the wood, you can't allow the wood to move around in some of these highly urbanized areas. But this is a little alcove of a channel. So we're sitting in the main channel, and then this is kind of the alcove. So this is a little bit of habitat. You can imagine if you were a juvenile fish trying to rear and you get a flood or a bank full event, you could actually get out of the high current of the main channel. You can rear in these areas until flood flows go down. So just another example of some of the work we've done. Dave is also going to have a different perspective on this photo, but this is one of my favorite photos. I always love going back to this one because this is the North Fork of Eagle Creek. And this is I think Dave's going to have a little sketch of the 6 logs that created this massive log jam. And you can see, we're just looking at the top, looking downstream, but this is like 10 or 15 feet or so of wood. And back behind it is a massive amount of gravel that's been deposited. And this is what we're doing with large wood jams. Some of these areas where we can actually slow down the velocity of the stream, create deposition of the gravel. So now we have spawning gravel for fish to spawn in. You have rearing habitat around the structures. These are some high level things of things that we can be doing in these streams when we think about large wood. And it kind of, you would think maybe, is this a passage barrier, right? That's a question that some people, if you wouldn't know, but there's actually a channel right around this, and fish passage is not a problem in most actually all large wood structures. They can get by these things. So I'm going to just touch briefly on a little bit on riparian, because riparian fits in nicely to everything we do, and riparian protection and riparian projects are always a key component of any restoration project. And we think about the wood, right? We're adding wood. So some of these projects we're doing, we're getting wood into the creek, but ultimately I always try to think of the long term, right? We were trying to do things right now in the short term, a year, 5, 10 years, but think about some of these areas where maybe 50 years from now, 100 years from now. Think of the legacy of what we're doing now and potentially planting a tree or a forest, and what's that going to look like in 50 years? Well, those trees potentially could be falling into the creek naturally for large wood habitat on its own. The Shade Our Streams program is something amazing that's, PG has been a big part of, and the Basin Council. And these are the types of programs that just are huge. They're all about engaging the landowners and the community. And it's an opportunity for us to get more trees, more riparian trees into the ground. I threw this in here just as an example of the different types of projects. So not all projects are created equal. This is a highly engineered bank project that was, there was a lot of erosion through here. So this is just one example. Not to say this is the type of project you would have on every project. You might just do some riparian planning, and you might not need, some of the stuff we're talking about here. In-stream structures, I'm going to just touch on this briefly. The photo, I love this old photo on the right, and it's hard to tell sometimes what exactly we're looking at. You can probably guess, what that is, but that's a lot of wood back in the old days, right? So we're trying to get more wood in the channel. It's not going to necessarily look like this photo, but that might be just adding large wood. It might be adding boulder clusters. We might be designing a channel. There might be a situation where we actually have to design a roughed channel that allows fish to pass up through the area. And of course, weirs, and there's other structures we can do. This is a little bit of, this was out on the, this was not in the Clackamas Basin, this is on the other side of the Tualatin, but this is a little project, and you can see we're looking downstream. There's a little bit of coarse wood on the right, not much. This channel is probably like 40 foot, maybe 50 foot active channel. And we added a little bit of wood working with one of the logging companies up there. And then this is the before. I mean, we added a lot of wood. So this jam, and I came back after the first winter, just like that other North Fork Eagle project we looked at, it basically backwatered the flow and just deposited a bunch of gravel. There's a massive pool for rearing habitat for fish. It's just a beautiful area. So this just, by adding some really large key pieces and some coarse wood mixed in, we create a really nice jam. And also realize these things, some of these things look really ugly. That can be good. Some of these things might not look so ugly. They might, there's no one size fits all in these. And that's why it's important to have ODFW, Watershed Council, manager, somebody come take a look if you have questions about doing a project. this is, and again, just an example of apex jam that's right in the middle of a channel during a low flow. More engineered, more highly engineered, and this is kind of, I believe this is in over on the Malala Basin. I want to touch just briefly on bank protection because this comes up a lot. We get a lot of calls in the middle of winter when, somebody calls and they say, hey, my bank's eroding, my house is right there. What do I do? And, and that's a big struggle, obviously, because a lot of these, as the channel evolves and migrates around and meandering and natural bank erosion is part of a natural process, we need to be able to deal with that. So in this situation, you've got some rock that's in here, which isn't always necessarily, the best thing. Sometimes that's needed, but in this example, you've got a big chunk of bank erosion. What can you do with this? Do you just let it erode? What are the solutions? So one of them might be just pulling back the bank. On this project, you basically had a bank that was incising and they pulled it back, put down a blanket, and then do a bunch of riparian planting. These things are really easy to do and just gives you an idea of some of the examples of things that you can do on these projects. Overall, today I just wanted to really hit the high level. We looked at banks. We just barely touched on water quality, but the large wood for me is a big part of what I do. I'm spending every day thinking about, where, in fact, I was just out yesterday looking at some wood. Where's our next project? Fish patches, I didn't touch on barely at all because Dave's going to touch on that here in this next one. He's going to go in really deep to the next on some of the work that he's done up on his creek. But just in summary, I want to let you know, we're here. My job is 100% funded to work with landowners, to work with the watershed councils, to work with all of the players that are out there. So if you have any questions at all around stream restoration, if you have a project, just, feel free to send me an email, give me a call. The watershed councils, the Soil and Water Conservation District, there's a lot of people out there that are their jobs are just to work with folks out there in the community landowners. So get familiar with your basin. I can come out and complete a habitat assessment for you if you want to know more about your stream. If you want to know what fish are in there, we can do that. A lot of that can be done just literally from GIS over the computer. And then we can identify some goals and some objectives and what do you want to accomplish. And a lot of these projects, it doesn't have to be just for the fish. A lot of them are great. They're great benefits for fish, but a lot of times we can do some good stuff for the landowners as well. So be thinking about that as you get into this. And like I said, I'm excited, hopefully, this will get out to some people that maybe, that didn't understand much about stream restoration. And Dave, I think, is going to take us, to the next step here. But I'm not sure. Do we want to take questions before we jump in further?
We had somebody write in a question for you, Dave, if you don't mind addressing this. And as a biologist, I'm glad this question is going to you and not me. So here's the question. How long does it take for sac fry to rear and begin roaming? And then do we know how many fry youngsters move into tributaries in neighboring waters such as Abernathy, Kellogg, and Johnson Creeks?
What was the second part? How many move in?
Yes.
From
other
areas?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, the second one, that's a hard question. I don't know if I'm going to have an answer. I mean, the first one there, it depends. Again, I talked about water, water quality temperatures. That's a big part of it, roughly, you know what I mean? So depending on the temperature of the stream, it's going to vary, but, roughly if you think, and by species as well, but if you can imagine, roughly you're looking at about 60 days. I mean, so if a fish is in there spawning, they're going to be typically, say if it's a coho, spawning in the winter time, in December, mid-December. So you're going to be looking at, basically a few months by that next spring, that once the eggs have incubated in that red, they're going to be popping out and, and that they're going to be in the next stage of that life history there, the next spring. So they're going to be popping out. Yeah. I mean, it's going to vary. Obviously there's going to be a little bit of a window from anywhere from, mid-February, March, April, kind of in that period. And then life history. I didn't get into all life history stuff because really there's a lot to it. And I think we're going to talk more about that in future presentations, but the coho, I mentioned the coho, they essentially have a 3-year life history. So they're going to spend a year, year plus in freshwater and a year plus out in the ocean coming back. And obviously Chinook, they have different life histories. So there's a lot of variation in there.
Cool. I got another question here for you. What is a riparian planting?
Good question. So riparian planting, so the riparian area And there's different definitions here as well, but it's essentially, it's that area that's adjacent to the river channel, to the water channel. So, and that varies in length. The riparian area might, by some definitions, might only be, 50 feet. It might be 100 feet, but it's essentially, it's that zone between that connects the waterway to the upland environment. And those areas are so critical because not only do they provide shade, habitat, everything, but they also are a corridor for wildlife species, right? So you can imagine, especially in these highly urbanized areas, wildlife, I mean, that's where they're migrating. So, I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's like 90% of species, animals, critters are migrating or relying on part of that for their life, for their life cycle. So it's that transitional zone between the upland and the river channel.
Okay, and the last one, my question to you is, for your role, is there a difference between your focus on like water, riparian areas, creeks, things like that, depending on if they have an anadromine or not? I mean, are you as much focused on like, tributaries that are just like resident fish?
Yeah. I mean, we are focused 100% on all species, I mean, but with that said, funding, a lot of funding comes more, like I said earlier, for ESA listed fish. A lot of times you have more, and the more species you have, essentially we go out to get funding, the more species you have on each project, it's going to benefit your project getting funding. But I will say that, cutthroat trout, are native migratory fish, and there are resident fish that, might not be anadromous that are in some areas higher up in the basin that are important for us. And we are definitely willing to work on a project like that if we find a good landowner that's interested, if we can find funding and do that. But yeah, it can be tough if you don't have, a lot of species. So I always like to tell everybody, check with us first, and I'll let you know and what we can do. And that's the start. But that is another good question is, funding is based on if you have salmon and steelhead and kind of some of those ESA fish, it helps out to get funding.
And the last one is, what is the best restoration project for fish habitat that streamside landowners can complete?
The best project for streamside. I mean, I touched on a few of them. The riparian is a real easy one. Like we said, there's groups out there. We can come in there and help out just planting it. If you need some trees, if that's an issue in that creek, then that would be something easy. Large wood can be easy too. These projects don't have to be, I showed you some really big ones, but they don't have to be massive. There's some, we can add smaller wood. There's lots of things we can do there. And just kind of surveying, understanding the creek, getting a little bit more information on what's going on there. That's also a really, getting more data is great. But like I said, giving it room, I think always think of that. How do we give that channel a little more room to function? So that's a really easy thing to remember, that, a lot of times we find ourselves encroaching on the channel. Structures are getting closer and closer, but if you can give a little more room, get somebody out there to maybe help you out to understand a little bit about what we can do. But the simple answer would be riparian planting is a really easy thing to do.
Definitely the slow game is riparian plantings. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks for answering those questions. I think we're going to transition to Bugney, aren't we?
Yeah, I think so.
Next up is Dave Bugney.
Yeah. Okay. Let's give this a whirl here. Let's see here. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, sir.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And I'm going to present the second leg of this tour. And hopefully you can stay with us for about the next 35 minutes, because that's about long what I'll be taking here. And we're going to be focusing on the creek we live on, because we've done quite a bit of work on it. And this picture here, for example, is one of the log jams that we put on our creek, and showing you basically how this all works. So what we will cover tonight, it's just basically a very simple applied approach. Who it's for the woodland owners, farmers, ranchers, and any others who live along a creek or a river, and just simply the curious. And why are we doing these restoration projects? Well, it kind of all boils down to what you see in this picture here. You see on either side of the photo are two logs that we placed as part of a larger wood jam last in November of 2020, or excuse me, in the fall of 2020. And yet just several months later, Here the salmon were, and you can see the female on her side building the red and the male behind her. So this is what our end game is. And we're going to talk about culverts a little bit and why sometimes they can be a problem. Dave touched on that a little bit. Engineered log jams, we'll focus on that a little bit more. Boulders and spawning gravels, side channels, salmon carcasses, tree and water quality and temperatures, funding sources and costs, references for further reading. And examples are drawn, as I mentioned, from our creek, Suter Creek, which is defined by the Department of Forestry as a medium type salmon steelhead bull trout stream, which is very common size in our basin, which means that it's got an average annual flow rate of about 2 to 10 CFS or cubic feet per second. And all work of this kind requires proper permits and can only be done during the approved times of the year, which varies from basin to basin sometimes. So why do we do these projects? Well, a number of reasons. I like to call it the 4 C's. We keep our waters cool, clean, connected, and complex. So we do that through a number of strategies. The first one is we provide fish passage. This shows you what we did we had a pair of fish blocking culverts near our property where our county road drove over. You can see them there on the left side. So that's a photo from 2014. In 2016, I wrote a grant to Portland General Electric to replace those culverts with the bridge that you see on the right that ultimately was installed. So I managed that project and designed the bridge as part of the community service aspect of the grant. But more importantly, removing those 2 culverts opened over 5 miles of stream to salmon and steelhead. So it was a major barrier to half of our properties that now is completely open.
Hey, Dave,
yeah.
Could you clarify if you have bull trout down in that area?
We do not.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm working on that. And also creating complexity, for example, pools, alcoves, diverse flows and currents, and dissipating hydraulic or kinetic energy in an otherwise simplified reach. So here's another picture of our creek. So imagine before we did this, all this was a simplified stream channel, like one of the ones that Dave showed before. There was no logs, it was scoured down to bedrock, there was no gravels or cobbles or anything. And so what we did is we put the wood in, as you can see, the wood was put in 2014, photo was taken last month. And now what we've got is ample cover for fish rearing. And historically, the quantity of wood in streams was much greater, as you can imagine, than it is today. And the biota of the forested ecosystems, evolved in and adapted to these features. So they're supposed to be there. The other thing that it's important to think about here is what's called hyperrheic flows. And that's just a fancy term for the percolation of water through sand and gravel and other sediments and permeable soils under and beside the stream bed. So I've put some yellow arrows in here. You can see this is another log jam on our creek where you've got a log there that's submerged essentially. And upstream of the log, you've got greater water pressure. So it's forcing water underneath the log, and there's less water pressure downstream. So the water is bubbling up. But then the other thing that's cool about this is that the water can scour around the side on that bank on the left side there, left side of this photo. And what happens there is 2 things. One is that in higher water, that lateral water pressure forces water into the bank, and the bank can store that water and then be released later on when the soil is and the climate is a little drier. That water can come back out and thus keep the stream a little bit more constant, not be so low. But then the other thing too is that the scouring, if you place this wood right, can help recruit more natural wood gravels. So that's very handy if you need more gravels for your creek. And of course, nature does this on her own too. And, contrary to myth, the beaver dams are usually passable by most salmon and steelhead. Plus, beavers create pools, ponds, and expand wetlands for salmonid rearing, reduce stream temperatures, and enhance hyperrheic flows. And we promote beavers in their habitat. And you can see this photo here was on our creek I took this back in 2013. And this was one of 5 beaver dams we had on our place. And this one happened to be about 4 feet tall and about 18 feet across. And you can see it's doing what it's doing. If you look in the background, they chewed down that 12-inch alder tree, and that's remnants of that are still there. And I don't call me sentimental, I don't know, but I like Benny Beaver. I mean, the upper left there, he's got a smile. That's the way our beavers are. They like it at our place. And if you really like to learn more about beavers, a good general reading book is Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter by Ben Goldfarb. I recommend that one. And where can this work take place? Well, if we look in the bottom map there, that's a map of Oregon for those that are outside of the state. And I blew up the map area of Clackamas County, you can see there. And the work that I'm talking about can of course take place any place in the county or in the state for that matter. But really I'm focusing on the more private woodland area bounded by this red ellipse. And the area where that red star is on the left side, that's where we live. So we live in the area of small private woodland owners mainly, and the larger industrial forest landowners are the darker green, and then U.S. National Forest is on the right in the amber, and then the more urban and the agricultural areas are on the gray to the left. And what's interesting about Clackamas County is that unlike most of the state, most of the private woodland is owned by small woodland owners. So that gives us an opportunity as small woodland owners to really do some good in our county and make some tremendous progress here. And most of Oregon's best coho habitat was historically in lower elevation streams, like where we live, not at the 4,000 foot level up at Government Camp or someplace like that, but down here in the Estacada, Oregon City, Molalla area. And fish habitat restoration work can also occur on agricultural and other natural working lands, and is important and can be integrated into planning efforts that you may have on your property, such as adding or improving fences, wetlands, etc. One thing we did was some tree canopy restoration funded by as was previously mentioned, the CRBC Shade Our Streams program, which was funded by Portland General Electric. So if you look at the photo on the left, that was taken 2016. That area on our property was invaded by invasive reed canary grass and blackberry. You can see how open it is there. And if you look at the photo on the right that I took last month, it's completely different. It's all replanted in 17 species of native trees and shrubs. Over almost 6,000 were planted over a stream length of about 1,800 feet, so about a third of the length of our property, and about 2.1 acres total were planted. So it's an amazing improvement, and it improves the canopy, the shading canopy tremendously. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. For example, why are trees and tree canopies important? Well, it's all about water temperatures, bank stabilization, cover, future large wood, and nutrients for aquatic insects, for example, from falling leaves and down wood, etc. So if we look at this graph, I want, because if we could do all this large wood and boulders, up the wazoo, but if the water's too hot and the fish die or get sick, it's all for naught. And so what we want to make sure is we really appreciate the seriousness of what's happening here. So if we look at this graph, we've undertaken a large study basin-wide of putting 80 sensors in the complete the Clackamas River Basin. And I put 7 of those sensors in the North Fork Eagle Creek Basin or watershed, which is what our creek flows into. So if you look at the horizontal axis there on the bottom, those are the days of the week or the weeks of the summer for last summer that we did this sensing in. So these sensors were registering temperatures every 30 minutes, 24/7. And then if you look at the vertical axis, that's the water temperature in degrees Celsius. And if you look at there's a horizontal red line goes all the way across at 18 degrees. That's defined by DEQ, our Department of Environmental Quality, as the maximum for salmonid rearing and migration at 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. And then if you look at the red line that goes a little bit of the ways across on the right side, that's the maximum for salmonid cold core habitat, which includes spawning, emergence from their eggs, and adult holding from September 1st to June 15th. And that's 16 degrees Celsius or 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Then you also see two ranges there that DEQ has set. The incipient lethal range from 18 to 25 degrees. And that's defined as where the fish start to have the breakdown of their physiological regulation, like their respiration and circulation, for example. And then the DEQ sublethal limit is where conditions can cause the lack of metabolic energy for feeding. They're more susceptible to pathogens. So we're starting to get some issues. And then salmon and salmonids in general will die instantly if the water is above 29 degrees. And so you can see here what we've done is we've taken those water temperatures and we've averaged them. So what you're seeing are not what's happening every 30 minutes, but we've taken that data and averaged it. So you're seeing the maximum rolling average per a 7-day rolling average. So you're seeing a more smooth curve of water temperature. And if you look at that bottom green curve, that's what you're seeing in the North Fork Eagle Creek, which again is our parent creek that we flow into up in the Mount Hood National Forest. The water is always cold. And Tim asked a good question about bull trout. Most likely bull trout could probably live up in that area because the water always stays cold. But then as you look at those curves, you see they're all very similar, which is a good thing because that means that our sensors are working properly. But you can see as you travel farther downstream that the water temperatures increases, which is what you would expect, right? Because there's more warm water coming in because there's areas that have lack of tree canopy and whatnot. So that's a concern. But then one thing that we basically discovered unknowingly is if you look above that green curve, you see that dark blue or almost black curve, which is more flat. And that was taken at the site of the previous photos I showed you where that tree planting was. So we inadvertently found a cold water source on Suter Creek, which buffers or moderates the warm waters to keep this area very cool. And so even during the hottest part of the summer, this area always remains cool. I always wondered why I always saw a lot of fry there, and they know, hey, it's cool here. It's like a natural air conditioner. That's what it is. But then if you go down to the west end of our property, about a little over a mile downstream, you see that darker or somewhat little lighter blue line. That's at the west end. It's still okay. It still falls within their limits, but it's warmer than this cold water source. But then as you proceed farther downstream in the North Fork Eagle Creek, you can see the temperatures up some. And those are starting to become a concern. They're not really that much of a concern yet, but they're becoming a concern. But the sad thing is that this is the best of the watersheds I've seen so far in Lower Clackamas. Some are extremely serious and concerning, approaching 30 degrees. And so that's something that needs to get addressed. And so what we learned from this graph is that waters that can exceed the thresholds for some audits in the lower North Fork Eagle Creek, so about the lower 4 miles of that creek, and lower Bear Creek during the summer months, but probably did not raise to the level that it's a huge concern yet anyway. The cold water source, as I mentioned, was discovered in Suter Creek. And the conclusion from this, as well as the other watersheds we're studying, is that tree canopies really need to increase across woodlands, farmlands, and any other areas where it's possible to do so that are areas of a concern. And now we're going to talk a little bit about water quality, and you can really get into sophisticated chemical analyses for water quality, but an easy and fun way to do it, at least I think it's fun, is you can go out there and survey your stream and count what different macroinvertebrates or aquatic insects you have. So if you look at those two photos on the left, the top one shows a neighbor of mine and I were out there in Suter Creek with just a simple device we made with a couple of broomsticks and window screen to trap the aquatic insects. And then the lower photo, we're looking at them under stereoscopes to try to identify them. Well, we're just amateurs. We got maybe 20 or 22 orders of aquatic insects identified. But then a couple years back, the Clackamas River Basin Council hired an outfit to do surveys basin-wide of 7 different places all across the Clackamas River Basin. And so they surveyed 7 places, and Suter Creek had the most diverse macroinvertebrate fauna anywhere that was discovered of those 7. And so I took that data that these folks did that really know what they're doing, and I broke it down in this pie chart so you can see the different orders of aquatic insects here, which is tremendous. It's just fascinating to me. And the big ones are the trichopter, which are the caddisflies. You see the stoneflies and the crane flies, but a lot of other ones in there too. And if you like to do this kind of stuff, there's a really good book I recommend, and I show it there, the Stream Keeper's Field Guide. And it's written at a high school or undergraduate level, so anybody can follow, and it's really fun to read, and that'll help you do that. Let's see. Hold on a minute. There we go. Culverts. Talk a little bit about culverts. Dave talked a little bit about them. Culverts come in all shapes, sizes, and materials. You can get them out of galvanized steel, concrete, plastic. They come in round, elliptical, squashed, or bottomless arch culverts. And generally, as Dave showed, you can find some that if they're properly designed and installed, they work just fine. There's nothing wrong with them. But sometimes, if they're not designed properly or installed properly, you'll get a problem. So if you look at this figure on the right, if the culverts are too small and the velocity through there is too fast, the fish can't swim fast enough against that higher velocity to make it, so they're blocked. Or if the culvert is too wide and the water flow is too low, they can't propel themselves up because there's nothing to propel themselves against. The bottom two, if there's not enough of a pool for them to jump from into the culvert, they can't get up through it. Or conversely, even if there is a pool, but the culvert is high enough, they can't cannot jump up into it. So those are problems that have arisen and need to be addressed. And so if you're concerned about culverts, either on your property or in your community, on forest lands, contact your local Oregon Department of Forestry Stewardship Forester. On other lands, contact the Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District, the CRBC, ODFW, or Clackamas County for additional guidance. And engineering assistance should be retained for difficult conditions, and sometimes a bridge crossing is a better alternative, like we showed you earlier on. But just to give you an idea of the scope of the culvert problem, I just went onto the ODFW website, and they have a really cool map there that shows all the fish barriers to fish passage in the state. So I zoomed in just on the lower Clackamas River Basin. So if you look on the left, that left ellipse, that's Gladstone, where the Clackamas flows in. The middle ellipse is Eagle Creek, and the lower ellipse is Estacado. So you're looking at a total Clackamas River length of about 25 miles or so. But all those black dots are barriers to fish passage. Now, this map isn't 100% correct, but even if it's 90% correct, it's a problem. And so these are the issues that really need to be dealt with if we want to help restore these salmonid populations. Now I'm going to talk about large wood a little bit. And, some people like to go bowling, some like to go rock hunting. I like to go out in the middle of nowhere and take pictures of wood in the creek. And so these are areas that Mother Nature has left her own devices. So these are not placed by humans. These are just out there, and we're, just as Dave was saying, just natural large wood recruitment. And you can see all the different configurations and whatnot. And the key takeaway of this for me is that it's dynamic, it's chaotic, it's random. But you can see if you get enough wood that they manage to hold themselves together. They're not going to last forever, but some of these large wood trees are absolutely enormous. Like this one photo in the upper right, that tree is about 5 feet across, and I had to really kind of scamper against it just to try to get a photo. You can see my wife, Marianne, in the lower left photo for scale where my cursor is. She's kind of smaller. You can see all the wood packed in there. So these are the places that the fish love. Now, what we tried to do is we tried to replicate that, and other people try to replicate it as well. So if you look at the engineered log jams that we've done, the photo on the upper left, that's a photo. You see that's Sutter Creek again. Again, you can look at the stream basin there. It's completely scoured out. There's no gravels, no nothing. You look at the two large cedar trees there in the background. Keep that for reference. If you look at the lower left photo, that was taken in 2014 after we had some large wood put in. You look at that tree in the background behind our son Vince there for scale. That tree is 34 inches, the diameter of breast height, very large tree with about a 10-foot tall root wad. Easily weighs 15,000 pounds. That one's not going anywhere. Then you look at the two logs in front of Vince there, about 20 or 30 feet in front of him. Those are about 2 feet in diameter, just for scale. Now, if you look at the photo on the lower right, that's the exact same place. You see the same tree, the same large down 34-inch DBH dug fir there. But we've added boulders here now. See, so we've added some complexity to the stream flow. It's recruiting gravels. We've added gravels. And you can't see those logs anymore because they're buried under a nice deep pool that's formed. So there's a whole lot now more complexity than what existed before. What stream characteristics and large wood configurations provide for a good project? Well, this is a really cool chart that ODFW has put together to help you determine this. And so on the horizontal axis there on the bottom, that's the average slope of your creek at the point of consideration. And then the vertical axis is the width of your creek, the bank full width, or the width that you might see every couple of years under high water. And if you look at that right ellipse, that's the area that we have. All of the projects that we've done would fall within that right ellipse. So we're in a real good sweet spot there. And you can use this graph to determine where you are. And this graph came from this manual here. It's an excellent manual. It's free. It's online. I reference it. I'll talk about that later. And other considerations you should think about, and to help alleviate any concerns that you might have, is that landowners are exempt from liability on lands under ODF jurisdiction, which is all private forest lands, if large wood causes damage. Consider donating logs from your property, because if you had to pay to do this or have to get grants to do this, prices can range from $500 to $1,000 per log delivered, depending on the size and if root wads are attached. We donated all the logs on our place from our own forest land. Logs may be obtained from fire salvage operations, can be placed with ground-based machinery or helicopter. We've done both on our projects, but the helicopters are much more expensive, as you can see. And I suggest, I haven't seen this written before, but just my own practical experience, don't place all log jams at once. You want to stagger them to minimize potential bark beetle outbreaks, which could affect your adjacent live Doug fir trees. Other factors to consider when constructing engineered log jams: the size or the diameter, specifically length of logs used, will depend upon the full bank width of your creek, and ODFW has guidelines for these, as I mentioned. Creeks larger than about 30 feet wide should have log jams engineered, in my opinion. For best fish habitat is formed at least 3 to 7 logs per jam. Leave limbs and branches if you can to increase stability and provide additional fish cover. And one must also consider wood rot. Again, I don't see much on this in literature, but just based on experience and plus being a former structural engineer, I can tell you wood does rot. And depending upon sizes and species and moisture content, it loses very roughly about 1% strength and density per year once the decay begins. And decay will begin, within a year after you place it. So consider using the largest diameter logs you can, those with the lowest surface to volume ratio. And of course, decay rate is usually slower in water than on land because the bugs, would drown a lot of them if they try to get in there. Nonetheless, the decay would occur. And the best species for strength and longevity are Western red cedar, even though it's weaker than Doug fir, it typically lasts longer. And then Douglas fir would be the next good choice, and then noble fir, Western hemlock, followed by hardwoods like alder and maple. And a large wood, not recommended without serious tie downs like David's shown within urban areas, near roadways, or where there's near sensitive residences, structures, or development downstream. The problem is that, these large wood, they look great when they're cabled right now, but 10, 15, 20 years from now, when they've rotted, the cables aren't going to do any more good. So they're going to float away anyway. You're going to have problems. Properly sized, sited, and designed large wood jams can last 50 to 100 years or more. And these have been studied. I know we've got a few we had on our place here that have been there for at least 60 years because that's the age of the trees that are growing out of them. We put boulders on our place. You can see here in the left side photo taken in 2014, we put boulders in and those were placed on a bedrock substrate. You can see our sun bins about 100 feet downstream for scale. And then if you look at the right side photo, that's the same exact area in Cedar Creek where this one on the left is, just taken last month. You can see how complex the area is with the boulders, and there's moss growing on them. It's retaining some coarse wood in the stream. We've added over 200 boulders on the creek, and you can see me there. We just rented a skid steer and just put the boulders in. What you want to do is you want to select boulders at least twice the size of the largest boulders that you observe in the stream to help minimize movement. You want really those boulders to be rumbling down the creek there. You want to arrange them in constellations or groups of 3 or more to enhance the upstream sediment and gravel deposition behind them. That's kind of the point. And place where the boulders would typically be found, such as in a creek that flows through an incised canyon where you'd have mass flow of soil and whatnot, bedrock dominated reaches like we have here, or where large wood jams are not practicable. In this case, this just happened to be an old rock quarry that was in operation from the 1920s to about the 1960s. And in the process of doing the rock quarry, they pulled all the gravels and boulders out of the creek, plus got rid of the part of our hillside. So it was a natural place to put boulders. Now we're going to talk about gravels. Why are gravels important? It's where salmon make their nests or their redds. And if you look at the picture on the left, again, that's Cedar Creek. That's one of the redds that were formed back in 2020. And the red area there, and the red ellipse, that's the approximate size of the area that was manipulated by the female salmon building a redd while the male was just sitting there watching her. And then if you look at the yellow ellipse, that's the probable location where she deposited her eggs. Obviously the water's carrying the eggs downstream some, but they probably, most of them anyway, probably fell in about there. Now, if you look at the 2 pictures on the right, I really love this document. It's from 1951, back when they actually drew artwork to show scientific information. And if you look at the female salmon here, the one upstream, she's flinging her body to create the cavity. And if you look at the current, or the picture on the bottom, you can see there the hypothesized current flow, how the currents are forming and eddying upstream of the redd. And then for coho, the redds are probably 4 to 6 inches deep. I've measured on our place. For Chinook, which we don't have, but I've measured them elsewhere, they're about 1 foot deep because they're a bigger fish. One thing they didn't really know about in 1951 was about hyporheic flows. So I drew that in there because the salmon know about them. They've probably known about it for 1 million years. and that's what helps to oxygenate the eggs. So as the water flows through that permeable substrate there, it helps to provide oxygen for the eggs, which are buried in that substrate. Now, we put a lot of gravels in the creek, about 150 tons or so. We've done it through various ways. Start in the upper left, we've used wheelbarrows. In the lower left, we use a mini loader. There's my wife, Mary Ann, and our son, Vince, with the mini loader. A friend of ours, Jake, up there with the wheelbarrow. We transported them. We erected a cable suspension system to transport gravels about 350 feet. We just built a steel hopper there out of some scrap steel and controlled it in a controlled manner down the hill. And so my wife was upstream there, or up the hill, and then I was down in the water, emptying the hopper and then letting the gravels fall. And then in the upper right, you can see you can just use a long flume. We had a couple of friends help us out. It's amazing. We have friends do this and they still come back for more. And the gravel costs around $350 for a full truckload, about 11 cubic yards. So it's not that expensive. And again, suggest placing pads about 6 inches thick, 12 inches for Chinook habitat, and about at least 50 square feet area. And place pads at the toes of pools and upstream and within large wood jams and boulder constellations to retain the gravels. You want to provide a thalweg, which is a path of lowest level, so the water can always have a place to flow in the summer. Of course, these gravels are going to move in high water. They can move hundreds of feet, but they're gonna reside someplace. And if you have enough wood and gravels, they'll find their natural setting point. Gravel sizing, you can purchase different sizes from the quarry like we did. And you can see there in the photo in the upper left, the different sizes of gravels that we purchased. When I first did this, I had no clue what size steelhead and salmon liked. So what I did was after the steelhead Elvin's had left the nest as fry, and so I knew it was safe, I went into 2 of these reds along our creek and took out about 55 pounds out of each red. And then I borrowed a friend of mine. He's a geotechnical engineer. He has a mechanical sifter. So you see that photo there of me. And so I put this gravel in there and I sifted it all. And then I grafted on this curve. And, we don't need to get into the weeds of the curve, but what's fascinating to me anyway, if you look at these 2 lines, those are 2 reds from 2 different fish, and they're very similar. So they're using very similar sized gravels. And so this told me, okay, they know what they want. And so that's how I tailored my my gravel so that I could put it in the creek. I mixed it to that proportion. Now we're going to talk a little bit about side channels. The side channel is nothing more than just a little channel off to the side of your creek or the river. And so in 2014 here, when we were doing some of this large wood work, we decided to construct this side channel, and you can see it there in the lower left-hand photo. And kind of the secret to these things, they're really pretty simple, but some people manage to screw it up, is that you want to keep the level a little bit higher than the normal low flow of the creek, because you don't want the water and low flow to flow in there and dry the creek up. So you keep it up a little high. Then you also want the creek, or excuse me, the side channel to slope somewhat so that the water naturally slopes downhill, but not too low, too slopey so that it backs up too much. But you can see here, this photo that I took last month, how well the side channel is working. So here's the creek in normal winter flow. You see the area there, the side channel is full of water, and it's now an active northwestern salamander and red-legged frog egg-laying area. So it's serving multiple purposes for fish and amphibians. And this is just a picture of the large wood we put in the side channel. And just this past month, we put in some root wads just to kind of modulate or regulate the flow of water in there a little better. Now, where are good places to enhance the fish habitat? Generally, wherever there's a lack of cover for fish and or lack of hydraulic complexity are good candidates. I think we showed those for enhancement. But there are also excellent places to focus on, and these are called areas of high intrinsic potential, which are spots based on flow, slope, and channel constraints, which are inherent properties of your watershed. Humans have nothing to do with that. They're particularly well suited for salmonid juvenile rearing, and these vary by species. So if you look at these 2 maps, which are prepared by ODFW, there's a map for the Clackamas River Basin for coho and one for steelhead. And the coho like one thing and steelhead like another. You can kind of see the green lines don't necessarily overlap. We were fortunate, for whatever reason, that I circled our place, but because we own enough length of the creek that we have high intrinsic potential for both coho and salmon in different areas. And nonetheless, I said, hey, I'm in for this, because if we've got the natural setting here, we need to do what we can to make things better. And one of the seminal papers on natural high intrinsic potential was written by Burnett and Reeves back in 2007, and I just took a quote out of that. And I think this is true. And basically, they say that widespread recovery of coho salmon is unlikely unless habitat can be improved in high intrinsic potential reaches on private lands, and that's what we exactly are trying to do. So as we wrap this up, on your next logging project, for those that are woodland owners, I suggest a few things here. Dave talked about the riparian area. Oregon Department of Forestry has regulated what that means. You know, nature doesn't know what that means. It just is what it is. But from a legal standpoint, riparian management areas can vary in width from 20 to 100 feet, depending on certain number of criteria. So when practicable, select times of the year to minimize soil compaction and ground-based equipment and avoid building roads within or near riparian areas. Check your road for drainage. Make sure you're not putting too much sediment in there. Try exceeding the limits for the RMA, if you can. And try to exceed the limits of the amount of wood that you're allowed to take out of the RMA to leave some for future wood recruitment. If your RMA has a lot of hardwood in it, like alder, maple, consider thinning some, or taking a length, maybe 100 feet or so, and just taking all the hardwood out and planting conifers to give some additional species diversity, because you want that conifers in there for additional long-term large wood. And then try thinking about exceeding limitations for leaving all the understory vegetation within 10 feet of trees, within 10 feet, and then within 20 feet for the trees to increase these buffer widths. When we did our last thinning project, we created what we call a no-touch buffer, and that was 80 feet wide. So we decided not to do anything within 80 feet of either side of the creek. And some of you may have heard of the Private Forest Accord, which is ongoing now. And when that's formalized into law, if it is, they'll revise some of these requirements for the RMA, as well as culvert and forest road requirements. Next, I'm going to talk about salmon carcasses, and we place salmon carcasses in the creek. And
hey, Dave, can I pause you for 1 second while you're on that last slide?
Sure.
I had some questions.
Go ahead.
I had some questions about, we had some questions coming up about riparian areas and protection. And so basically, and I know that you're probably a little tuned into this, but somebody was asking if the riparian protection for logging companies has changed, because especially during these last several years, there's been a lot of cutting within private forest areas, and so the question was, are these protections eroding, and are they not having the setbacks that they historically did?
That's a good question. The short answer is no, they're not eroding, and to go a little bit more deeply into this, the Private Forest Accord is going to make those even stronger. So, they're nothing's perfect. You can throw rocks at anything, and I think there's always room for improvement, and that's the intent of this Private Forest Accord, is that they will make those riparian areas much more stringent.
And just while you're on it, we had another question real quickly about, is there tax advantages to riparian shade development for the landowners who pays to move big logs into the streams?
Tax advantages, I'm not aware of.
I can hit on that one. I don't know if you hear me, Dave.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a tax incentive program that they can call. They can connect with us, and we can give them more information. But there is a riparian lands tax incentive program that we have, and so yeah, that's one tool definitely we could utilize. So check in with ODFW if you have questions on that.
I wasn't sure that one was still in existence, because I remembered that one was around, but I thought they got rid of it. So they kept it?
Yeah, it's it's a staffing thing. That's always the struggle, is that you need staff to implement these things. But yeah, either it's worth a call if somebody's really interested in it. Let us check into it.
Okay, good.
Thanks, Dave, for answering those.
Yeah.
Sure. So getting back to the salmon carcasses, we put these in there mainly to provide marine-derived nutrients. So think of this: you're bringing nutrients from the ocean upstream, where this has historically been going on for millennia, mainly nitrogen, but other nutrients as well. And these are a benefit to virtually anything that utilizes the watershed. And I've seen carcasses dragged hundreds of feet by wildlife taking advantage of it. And we don't place many. We annually place about 40 along the stream over a length of about 4,000 feet. And you can see in the lower right-hand photo that I try to anchor them underwater as best I can to keep them, from floating away. I usually stick a stick through their gill and then out through their mouth, and then I jam it in the large wood to keep them there. And then this supplements the natural large or the natural carcasses that come from the salmon that do migrate and steel that do migrate upstream. If you look at the recycled tubs, we think that's appropriate to use recycled tubs with to use the coho salmon carcasses that we get from the creek. So make a good use of them, or that we get from the salmon hatchery. I'm sorry. And if you look at the lower left-hand photo, that's a salmon carcass that's completely inundated with caddis larvae. I've never seen it so inundated before. It just totally blew me away. So I had to take a picture of it. They're just all those little brown twigs you see are actually caddis larvae. And then if you look at the photo in the upper left, that's actually wasn't a carcass. It is now, but it wasn't a bear. It actually caught that salmon coho in our creek and bit the head off. They like to eat the brain, and then he left the carcass there on that log for other predator scavengers to take advantage of. Potential funding sources: consult your local watershed council, soil and water conservation district, the stewardship forester, or DFW, or Department of Agriculture, Natural Resources Conservation Office. For all these different programs, tax incentives, like Dave was referring to, sometimes they come in, sometimes they go out. And so it's good to check in, just like Dave said. New programs are being created almost every day. In summary, this is a photo. We have a 6-foot waterfall in our creek, and so this was actually a freeze frame I took out of a video I shot of a salmon jumping up our fall. So that's migration in 2020. And then this is the photo you saw at the beginning of the presentation. Here's some salmon spawning in the creek in 2020. So once they migrate, they spawn. And then here's their progeny right here. So last summer we captured these, from some of the salmon in Suter Creek. So they're rearing now and having a good time because the water's nice and cool and they're happy. So landowners, while working with the appropriate state, county offices and nonprofit organizations, can seek funding to restore streams and riparian areas within their properties, and possibly tax incentives. So that's good to check that out. Many of these projects can be done with just a good amount of common sense and working with the right agencies. They want you to succeed. For those areas with sparse or no tree canopies, consider implementing a tree planting program. Increasing water temperatures probably are the major concern right now. Also, trees provide a source of future in-stream large wood. Remember, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago and right now. And tinker with caution, know your limits, seek design guidance as required, as I suggested in the previous slide, and realize that nature will always be testing your efforts. So if we tie this all together to keep our waters cool, clean, connected, and complex, if you have high intrinsic potential, it's icing on the cake. You should take advantage of it. If you've got good water quality, like we know we do, and we did, good flow, which we do, and suitable water temperatures, which we do, another great asset. If you have good habitat access, you have no barriers to fish passage. Of course, we had barriers and we showed you that, so we solved those. We don't have that problem anymore. And if you have good physical habitat like large wood, gravels, low sediment, intact tree canopy, pools, etc., which we didn't before, and we showed you how we addressed all that. So now you got the intersection of this Venn diagram. Perfect. There should be, this should be the Club Med for fish. That's what we hope it's going to be. So for that part of our basin, including the tributary watersheds below Promontory Park, which is about 7 miles upstream of Estacada, it's up to all of us to try and do our part to address these challenges, because this is mainly all private land, as you saw in that map I showed you early on. State and local governments cannot do it all. And for further reading, I'm going to upload a list of about several dozen pamphlets and books and whatnot that I find are worthwhile, that if you're interested, check those out. But I chosen 4 here. To me, you always have to have a why. Why are you doing this? And, to me, the ultimate book on that is the Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. I first read that in high school, and ever since I read it about every 3 to 4 years, just because it's one of the best books I've ever read. And his talk about the land ethic is what it's all about. And Fish in the Forest is another good book about drilling into what we're talking about here, a good representation for the general reader. The Hows, an excellent illustrated manual, is Oregon's Forest Protection Laws by the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. Easy to read, full of diagrams. And then that document I showed you from the various state agencies about how to do this. Very good documents. If you'd like to learn more in the field, CRBC has a Healthy Streams and Forest class out at our place that I teach. Didn't teach it last year, but we taught it several years prior to that. This one's coming up April 9th from 9 to 12. It's free. This is the time where you can drill into this stuff. You can touch it, see it, smell it, look at it, do whatever you want with it. And we've got 3 hours to really talk about these things in detail. And if you want even more, OSU Extension Service has a tree school online, and I'll be teaching that class on April 12th. And these aren't redundant topics. These will be complementary to one another. So if you're interested in learning more about different things, sign up for that class. And if you still want more, I've got a series of videos here that we put on that you could just, I guess, look for me. My son told me I had a YouTube channel. Didn't know I did, but I guess I did. And but anyway, some of these videos last from a minute and a half to 24 minutes. And so you can get into much detail as you want about how we've done a lot of this stuff. And this is the last slide. And as Dave mentioned, this is one of the most fantastic large wood jams I've ever had the privilege to be involved in. And if you look in the upper right, this is a photo of a drawing that was done by a member of ODFW in the North Fork Eagle Creek, which again, our creek flows into. At the time, this was a barren creek. There was just scoured down to bedrock. And they put these 6 logs in with a helicopter. And they're large. They were donated by a good neighbor of ours. These trees are 2.5 to 3 feet to 3.5 feet across. They were large. And I told him he needed to have large ones to resist the hydraulic load in the creek, which he did. And so with only those 6 logs, you can see all the large wood that has been retained now in 16 years. I took this photo in 2018. But the logs, the structures are still here. They're still doing their thing. They've created a myriad of pools, lots of gravels. As Dave said, it's perfect. And so we're currently fundraising for an even larger wood project on North Fork Eagle Creek next year. We hope it's successful. If it is, it most likely will be the largest in the whole Clackamas River Basin, if not Oregon. So with that, I will end and open it up for more questions.
Tim, do you have more questions for Dave?
You know, we did have a question about the difference between, you mentioned removing deciduous trees for, you know, trying to select for conifers. And so, you know, someone just pointed out that, you know, deciduous trees bring back a lot of nitrogen to soils. And so anyways, do you have a take on that, Dave?
Yeah, exactly. And they might have missed that. I said, you know, you don't want to take out all the hardwoods. You want to just do some selective thinning so that you still keep the hardwoods, because as I think I mentioned in there, that particularly alders, you know, they're natural nitrogen fixers. So they are bringing, or they are taking atmospheric nitrogen and fixing it and being able to make it utilized by plants and animals. And so as their leaves fall, their leaves, I think, at least have, if I remember the statistic, at least 5 times the nitrogen content by weight than conifer needles. So they serve a very important function in the creek as well as on land. So yeah, definitely don't remove all the alders, but you can do thinning, or like I say, do them at select patches, which they call conversion blocks. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Let's see. You know, the only thing that maybe I'll just ask you a question real quick, Dave, is that, you know, maybe not to have a debate, but, you know, you kind of point out, you know, the intrinsic potential and, you know, the good stream temperatures and things like that. And the only, I guess, pause that I have about that sometimes is that, you know, no matter what we do, these lower tributaries, you know, way downstream are always going to be warmer than, you know, the upper tributaries. We know this, you know. I'm fully agreement with you. I think that, you know, the processes, you know, are broken down there. You know, we know that they're hyporheic, not flowing, things like that. But, you know, I think that there is some value on a lot of these lower systems. I'm looking at them for restoration value, because we know that, you know, we see a lot of these nomadic, you know, fry, par, things like that go down to these lower areas. Many areas, you know, in Sacramento, they see fish go down into, you know, the delta into these areas and distribute and get a lot of growth and survival. And so I think sometimes it just gets a little complex when we start thinking about the full use of how fish are using things during winter, summer, things like that. But no doubt your headwaters are absolutely critical for you know, providing good refuge for this critical stage of fry and, you know, in par level.
Yeah, in fact, that's a good point, because actually Maureen Cavanaugh, she was at U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and now she's at BPA, did a study in the North Fork Eagle Creek and found that because of the cooler temperatures there, the steelhead actually stay there until they're ready to smolt. And so they're 2+ year old steelhead that, you know, they find the habitat is suitable. They figure, well, why should I move, you know? And we know that, in fact, just yesterday, I think it was, we were walking the creek and we saw our fry that had hatched last year. So they were the November 2020 salmon that you saw, those that laid the eggs, they hatched, say, in January of 2021. They spent this whole summer at our place. They're still here. And so they're ready to bolt downstream, probably what, April, something like that, maybe. And so they still find it acceptable to be here. So yeah, I find that, like you say, they're gonna go wherever they're gonna want to go. And hopefully they can find where we're seeing these areas of warmer temperatures. Hopefully they can find these cold water refugia in these little micro areas where they're going to live. Otherwise, if all the temperatures are like this, we're in a world of hurt.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions? Thought I saw a hand raised, but I don't see it anymore. Well, we sure want to thank both of our Daves for all of your good work over the years, and for joining us tonight with your expertise. It's just it's a real learning process. I remember the Gang of Three when they were doing the Spotted Owl, and the professor from Washington said, "The more we learn, the more we realize how little we know." But we're learning more perhaps than we're forgetting, and it's largely a result of dedicated professionals like Dave Stewart and landowners like Dave Bugney. So with that, assuming nothing else is going on, I want to wrap up. Our next session will be in 2 weeks on the 22nd, again at 6 p.m. And we'll continue to focus on water and fish with habitat restoration successes and the Department of Fish and Wildlife STEP program and restoration sponsorships. You can use the same link that you used tonight to get on it. And if you're already registered for the event, we'll send a reminder via email the day before. There's a link to register, and Tim, you can pull that up. We will send you a thank you email with these links, as well as a link to the recording. Remember that all of our work over the past almost a year now is recorded and available to you. And there you can get continuing education units, CEUs, from Clackamas Community College. Our thanks again to Dave and Dave for tonight's program. And for those who would like a hands-on field experience of many of the topics presented, please keep an eye out for Healthy Streams and Forests, the classes taught by Dave Bugney at their family forest in rural Estacada. It has always been popular and informative. We also thank our gold sponsors, Oregon Beverage Recycling Cooperative and Clackamas Water Environmental Services, and bronze sponsors, the Clackamas Water Providers, Metro, Port Blakely, and the Geological Society of the Oregon Country. They're helping us to keep this conference free for all participants with their support. Every little bit helps, so if you would like what you see, if you do like what you see, and I think many of you seem to have, please consider a small donation. Thanks for joining us tonight, and let us know what you thought of the program, and we'll see you in 2 Tuesdays on the 22nd of February. Again, thanks to Dave and Dave. Good night, all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Nothing better than learning about culverts.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Good night.
Thanks. Good job, Tim.
Good job, Dave. Good job, Dave.
Good
Thank
job,
you.
Bill.
Thank you all. It was wonderful.
Thanks, Cheryl. Good seeing you, Paul.
Good night.
Paul. Good night. Bye, Eric and Victoria. Bye, Lisa.
Bye, kids.
Bye, Vic.
Good night, kids.
Bye,
Get to
Carol.
bed.
Bye,
Good
Ginger.
night, Henrietta. Good night.
Get to bed.
Yeah, you slip them $5, they'll watch anything.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. This is
All right.
Katinka. It was nice to see you all.
Nice
Thanks,
seeing you,
Katinka.
Katinka.
Okay, bye.
Bye, Carol. Bye, Ginger.
See, it's like everybody knows everybody.
Is there a John boy in there? Is there?
Yeah, right.
There was a John earlier.
All right.
Thanks, Tim.
I'm gonna go eat some dinner. Good night.
Me too. Bye-bye.
Good idea.